I'm Steve Setchell. I want to welcome you tonight to our first session of the academic year in DePauw's Virtual Alumni College. If you're tuning in for the first time tonight, the Virtual Alumni College began last year. It's providing alumni with opportunities for lifelong learning and a chance to
I'm Steve Setchell. I want to welcome you tonight to our first session of the academic year in DePauw's Virtual Alumni College.
Leading us in the discussion,
you're tuning in for the first
Jeff
time
McCall.
Tonight. The Virtual Alumni College began last year.
It's
providing alumni with opportunities for lifelong learning and a chance. I'm Steve Setchell. I want to welcome you tonight to our first session of the academic year in DePauw's Virtual Alumni College. Leading us in the discussion. You're tuning in for the first time tonight. The Virtual Alumni College began last year. It's providing alumni with opportunities for lifelong learning and a chance. I'm Steve Setchell. I want to welcome you tonight to our first session of the academic year in DePauw's Virtual Alumni College. Leading us in the discussion. Tuning in for the first time tonight. The Virtual Alumni College began last year. It's providing alumni with opportunities for lifelong learning and a chance. I'm Steve Setchell. I want to welcome you tonight to our first session of the academic year in DePauw's Virtual Alumni College. Leading us in the discussion.
Just this past Friday is op-ed
Virtual Alumni College began last year. It's providing alumni with opportunities for lifelong learning and a chance.
Focused on the federal communications and called for the end of the National Football League blackout. So it's clear that Dr. McCall should lead us in a discussion on a number of topics tonight that hold our interest. The focus this evening will be crisis in journalism. Dr. McCall is going to begin with about 15 minutes of comments and then keep it very interactive. So please take advantage of the link on your screen and type in questions at any time, and I'll be happy to read those to Dr. McCall as the conversation goes on. So at this time, I'd like to thank Dr. McCall for giving up his time and expertise to alumni as he does frequently.
Thanks. It's always great to talk to alums. Thanks, Steve, for having me, and I look forward to our conversation this evening, and welcome to all of the alums who are out there on the internet now. This is a topic I think of great importance to our nation, frankly, because I think we need to rely on sensible journalism and quality journalism to inform us as a citizenry about the issues that are important to us. And clearly the constitutional framers, when we created our government, our republic, created a free press inherent in the First Amendment as a way to be a watchdog and hold the powerful government leaders and non-government leaders as well accountable, hold their feet to the fire. And as a citizenry, then we are to benefit from having the members of the press serve that role. We can't be out there gathering information and collecting information and interviewing important people, but we need the press to do that for us. Now, of course, in recent years, we've seen the press under assault in many ways. Part of that is self-destruction from within, where the press maybe hasn't performed as well as it should, or maybe hasn't managed its business functions as well as it should. But there are other factors in play as well. And so, I mean, I think it is fair to say we have a crisis in journalism because we need good journalism, and the journalism may not be as good as it has been in the years past. But beyond that, there's a factor that some people are getting out of the news reading business. Consumers, customers, citizens are not as absorbing as much news as they would have in the past. Studies confirm that. Now, there's a sense here that as traditional media fall back or lose readership or viewership, that new media takes the place of that. The evidence is that the new media is not taking the place of traditional journalism, that people who used to consume news from a newspaper or television or radio or whatever, who now don't consume news, are not necessarily getting news at all. Now, they might think that they're getting news because they might say, well, I get my news from the internet. Okay, well, where do you go on the internet? Well, I'm on ESPN.com getting the stats for my fantasy team. Or The Daily Show, or Facebook. And an interesting thing about Facebook is there are a number of people now who say they get news by browsing Facebook. But the other thing is they don't believe most of what they read on Facebook. So it's kind of like, well, then that's not news really, because it's not the kind of information that you can use to forward your life or make decisions at the polls or make decisions about government is functioning or anything like that. So there's a crisis in journalism. Part of it's brought on by itself, but part of it is because of us as citizens. And I think we need to kind of get a sense of where it's going, what difference that makes for us. And you and I had discussed this webinar several months ago and looking forward to what the topic would be. And the topic we decided was the crisis in journalism. Well, and how handy it is that just last week, the Gallup organization, a highly respected polling organization, the Gallup organization released its annual study about Americans' trust in the mass media. And the gist is basically that Americans don't trust their own mass media. And the percentage of Americans that either have a great deal or even a fair amount of trust in the American news media is now down to 40%, which is an all-time low for the duration of Gallup polling on this particular issue. And I think it's worth noting that this is a trend that has gone on now for 15 years. In 1999, the figure was 65%. We're down now to 40%, which ties the previous all-time low, which would have been 2012. Frankly, I wouldn't be surprised to see continuing deterioration. And interestingly, the main reason that the public says they don't trust the media is because they think the media is biased, right? And the percentages on that suggest that 44% of Americans think that the media is too liberal, and 19% think the media is too conservative. But either way, those are both bad numbers, whether you think it's too liberal or too conservative, because that means that you don't trust what's coming down that news pipeline. Interestingly, the number of Americans, 19%, who think the media is too conservative, that's a 6-point jump in just a year. But back in 2007, it was also 19%. So it's hard to know whether that's a real trend or just statistical noise at this time. And you might say, well, you know, during the Obama administration, it's jumped to 19%. But keep in mind, back in 2007, it was the Bush administration. So it's hard to know whether politics of any one year affect these perceptions. But I think they're worthy of our attention. And you know, sometimes people ask me, well, why do people perceive that the media is too liberal and not so much that they're too conservative? Well, that's really a complex thing to figure. But there is data out there that indicates that reporters are more likely to lean left. Okay, I mean, this isn't a shock to a lot of folks, but there's evidence, polling data and such that more reporters who work in newsrooms are likely to vote Democratic or to support liberal causes or issues. That's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing when you get right down to it. But there is a perception then that these political leanings might be drifting into the news reporting. And people say, well, why are newsrooms so left? Well, I'm not sure that they're so left, but they probably lean left. And that's a culture, you know, that we see in most newsrooms. Most of these people went to college. I think there's also a sense of most journalists that they want to right wrongs, they're crusaders, and I think that might tend to maybe give them a little bit more of an edge reporting on certain issues and not. But excuse me, but I do think that perhaps the audience is sensing that there's bias in news. And let's face it, you know, the result says that excuse me, trust is declining. You're not going to trust organizations that you think are biased, whether they're biased in terms of liberals or conservatives. Right. So I think that's worth us thinking about for a second. Okay. I think another reason we're seeing some of this decline in confidence in the media, frankly, is that the news agenda has been softened in recent years. I mean, there used to be a notion that the news covered government, the news covered the economy and matters of real interest to us. But if you look at the news agenda, and again, there's data to support this, the types of stories we see, even in network news now, have drifted off into sensational, pop culture, human interest, slice of life kinds of stories, and we don't see as much what veteran journalists would call hard news. Right. So when the audience tunes in for news, and let's say you're a serious citizen and you're a serious news consumer. You tune in the news and you see stories about Beyonce's rumored marital troubles.
Sure.
You're out of there, okay? Or you're a serious news consumer and you tuned into CNN last spring, and for several weeks in a row, it's round-the-clock updates on a missing Malaysian jetliner. Now, I mean, that's a tragedy. It's too bad that happened. But let's face it, in terms of high impact, which is a news component that news editors should be judging in terms of whether we want to put this in the news or not, there's not much high impact there, particularly for news consumers in the United States. So I think that softening of the news culture has been a factor for us. And I want to share one statistic that I think is of interest. 77% of the public thinks that the press focuses too much on sensational news. But if you ask news producers and editors, only 29% of them think that there's too much focus on sensational news. So there's a disconnect between what the public wants and what the news producers think the public wants, right? And my own sense is that most serious news consumers want real news. That's not to say they don't want some happy stories and some human interest stories, but the balance, I think, is out of whack. And I think they're sensing that as the news agenda has softened, that the real news consumers depart. The people who are not real news consumers, they're not joining the audience looking for information about celebrities or pop culture, because they're getting that from 20 other places, including the break room or at Facebook or wherever else they're going. And one other aspect in terms of soft news agenda, I don't think there's any question that over the last few years, the news of the economy should be a really important thing for us to be following. I mean, we had the economic troubles of several years ago. The economy is still not roaring back. Maybe we should need more news of the economy. Well, interestingly, Media Matters is an organization that critiques and analyzes media. They lean left, by the way, but Media Matters has studied how news of the economy is covered over recent years, and they've determined, and this has been consistent now for a couple of years, that of all the news stories about the economy, only 2% of all these news stories include an economist, an honest-to-goodness economist, in the discussion of the economy, which I find fascinating. I mean, how can you cover the economy without at some point getting input or analysis from an honest-to-goodness economist? And they define economist as somebody who studies, has a graduate degree in the economy. And so the question is, well, where are they getting their news sources for stories about the economy? They're getting them from other journalistic organizations. The number one source for a story about the economy is another journalist. So reporters are interviewing each other. And then beyond that, the next most common source for stories about the economy are political operatives who are always then trying to run some sort of agenda, either in support of the administration or against the administration. Right. So that makes the tone more shrill and probably doesn't inform us all that well either about what's going on with the economy, which, getting back to that notion of high impact news, that news which affects most of us, I mean, it's hard to find an American that is not affected somehow by employment, interest rates, you know, the stock market, all those kinds of things, which probably need more serious attention. Another factor that I think is going on in the world of why media trust has diminished amongst the public is that it's now okay and cool to bash the media in public. Talk radio, of course, for years now has been bashing the news media, bashing. The news media is unfair, the news media is biased, they're all in cahoots, and that sort of thing. A lot of that comes from conservative talk radio. Sean Hannity's a great example of that, for example, okay? But it's not just conservative talk radio now. The White House, over the last couple of years, has made a point on a number of occasions to criticize the news media. Their favorite target, of course, is Fox News Channel. But even just last month, President Obama said in an address at a fundraiser, and I want to make sure I get this quote right, but President Obama said, "If you watch the nightly news, it feels like the world is falling apart." And I think, you know, that's a backhanded criticism of the news industry, which is trying to cover what's going on in the world. And clearly there are some dangerous places in the world. And it's kind of interesting that since he made that quote now, in recent weeks, we've seen a much different tone from the president about addressing the world's danger spots. So in many ways, I think we're seeing cumulative effects of several of these factors that are leading to a decline in trust amongst the media. And the one thing I'd want to say here is that I think this is really bad for our democracy. You know, it hurts us as a nation when people don't engage the news. It hurts us as a nation when the news agenda is not sufficient or accurate or fair, because we need information. We're only going to be able to get it from the news media. And if we disengage from the news because we think it's fair or it's not interesting enough or whatever, we as a citizenry are left uninformed about the issues that should be important to us. And that affects us in terms of activism in our own communities. That affects us certainly on election day. And there's an election coming up in November, general election. You would think people need to go to the polls and be informed. And they're not. And there's a new term now for people who are disengaging the news process. And these people are called bystanders. The Pew Research Center uses that term a lot in their research by pointing out these people are news consumers, they're interested, they could pass a current events quiz in McCall's electronic journalism class, but then there's a whole and growing category of American citizens now that they refer to as bystanders. They're not consuming the news, they're not particularly interested in the news, and they're uninformed. Well, again, getting back to our constitutional framers, they assumed that people would be informed of what was going on in the world. And that, you know, to be your own governor, you need the power which knowledge gives, which is a semi-quote from James Madison. So anyway, we see all these things going on, and when you look at the public perception of the press and the fact that we've got a lot of bystanders, I think then we end up with this study that just recently came out from the Annenberg Public Policy Center, where only 36% of Americans can name the 3 branches of the United States government. And I find that rather frightening because, I mean, most of here at an elite liberal arts university like DePaul, we think, hey, everybody knows the 3 branches of the United States government. Sure. But we're a selective group now. Only 36% can say that. So you've got 64% of Americans who have all the rights and responsibilities of everybody else, but they don't even know one of the basic functions of the American Republic in terms of these branches. And another scary thing is only 68% of the American public now believes that freedom of the press is important. Now you might think, okay, well that's over 2/3, but that means 32% of Americans on a survey would check the box that say freedom of the press is no big deal and unimportant. And it really is important for some of the reasons we've already mentioned here. So anyway, how about if we tee it up with those kinds of thoughts? I'm interested in hearing what people might have type questions in about. And I'm looking forward to some interaction here and some discussion.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. McCall. We have several questions streaming in already.
Great.
And I would encourage others to submit their inquiries as well. I'm going to go first to Chicago. Craig Stokely, class of 1967. Hello, Craig. He asks, I grew up with Cronkite, Huntley, Brinkley, McGee. What has caused the editorialization and point of view trend in much of the reporting over the years since then? Where will this lead in the years ahead? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Why?
I think the trend of getting opinion into straight news reporting is a bad thing, because I think most viewers and news consumers have trouble differentiating what's commentary and what's real news, fact-based. And by the way, I'm fine with commentary and analysis, all right? I mean, I write columns for newspapers where I'm clearly putting my opinion into there. Sure. But on the other hand, those are in sections of a newspaper clearly defined as commentary or opinion. Right. The problem ends up then in news programming, even like cable news, where they come on like, oh, here's a news program, and then people are jumping in with opinions, or the producers are writing angles or using terms that might suggest a slant to the news. And audiences are sensitive to that, I think, okay? Mm-hmm. And you know, they talked about, you know, the Huntley, Brinkley, and Cronkites of the world. Those folks grew up in an era of broadcast journalism. They entered the profession and grew professionally at a time when fairness was a really key standard. Okay. And, you know, and like Howard K. Smith and Eric Severide and some of those guys who we remember, they were part of the Murrow crowd. Edward R. Murrow was president of CBS News at one time. He hired many of those people who created that CBS News machine for many years, and it was clear that they were focused on fairness. And interestingly, a lot of people thought Walter Cronkite, you know, was the most fair, straight anchor guy ever. Okay, and we know now that for most of his career, he was a guy who had very specific political leanings. But people didn't know it when they were watching his broadcast, for the most part. Now, some people look back and say, oh, yeah, we knew that. But, I mean, he couldn't have been the most trusted man in America at that time, and for many years, if people thought he were pushing an agenda all the time, okay? And the same with guys like Howard K. Smith. And, you know, Murrow was the kind of standard setter for all those things, and we know that Murrow had political leanings as well. But he tried to emphasize fairness. And one last thing I'd say about this, many of these people I've been mentioning as legends in broadcast journalism in the early days worked for CBS. CBS at that time was run by William Paley, who was chairman of the board and president of CBS. It was Paley's vision that the CBS News division was not to be a profit center. Now, they didn't want to lose money, obviously, but he said, in his board meetings, the CBS News division is run to serve this nation, to get information out, to inform the citizenry. We'll make our money, which they did plenty of, so it's not like these guys were on a poverty line or anything.
Right.
They made plenty of money, but they did it in their entertainment divisions and the other holdings they had, and that took a lot of pressure off the CBS News division because they could use their funds. They, you know, if, you know, when they did some documentaries that Murrow did in the 50s in prime time, they lost money on those things, all right? But he did them. You know, he did one on migrant workers. He did the McCarthy broadcast.
Right.
And sponsors were hesitant to get in there, but they did them anyway, and they lost money. You will have a hard time now finding in cable news or broadcast television or really any news organization that is willing to say, we're not going to be a profit center, we're going to do the news that needs to be done right. Anyway, that's a long answer, but that's a great question.
Great. Next we'll go to Jessica Blevins, class of 2003. And before we do that, I understand we did have some technical difficulties at the beginning of the webinar, so my apologies for that. I think we've corrected those now. But thank you for bearing with us. Jessica writes, since affiliates around the nation rely on 4 free news feeds like AP and CNN for national and international news stories and video, what impact do you think these feeds have when it comes to the growing distrust the American public has in TV news? This can also include the feed that the station is affiliated with, like CBS. How much agenda setting do you think is happening from these national outlets? How does that impact viewers when local affiliates broadcast them?
That's a great question too, and hi Jessica, it's great to have you joining us. Jessica did a great job at WGRE on our board of directors for a number of years, and I remember her well. And Jessica was a professional news person herself for a number of years as well, so she understands how the news business works. She could answer this question as well as I could, but I'll give my perspective on that. It really gives those news organizations like Associated Press and CNN a lot of leverage in setting the national agenda, because local TV affiliates really don't have any access to go cover national news on their own. They have to rely on these services that are provided from CNN or their network, partner in New York City, or AP, whatever it turns out to be. So those handful of organizations have a huge say in what becomes a national agenda. So if instead of covering, the ISIS terrorist situation, which we didn't cover very well for a long time, and we're covering, celebrity trials or Oscar Pistorius or Casey Anthony or missing jetliner, these local affiliates are at the mercy of CNN's video service, or what they get from the network headquarters at CBS or the Associated Press. So those big news organizations have a really huge influence on the national agenda, probably more than they should, and it does lead to what we refer to in the news research business as consonance, where a lot of news organizations end up covering the same thing all the time, and that the agenda is not very broad.
Okay, great. Got another question lined up here, but we can take a few questions from the crowd and here in Watson Forum as well. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring a mic to you. The next question comes, I think, from some familiar names, Dave and Martha Tucker.
Sure.
Class of 1975. And they ask, can you speak to the impact of the proliferation and fragmentation of the media as well as the internet in relation to the issues you've raised?
Well, that's another great question. Fragmentation is a problem. A lot of people are getting their news from a variety of sources. They're not necessarily getting all the same things, and I think the biggest difference is between traditional media and web-based media, or the internet.
Okay.
And there's plenty of evidence to suggest if you get your news primarily from traditional media, you're getting different news than you are if you're getting it from the web. And that makes it difficult for us as a citizenry, I think, to be weighing and balancing the same issues if we're not talking the same conversations. Or if you have a different batch of information than I have, it's going to be hard for us to get together and come to political solutions. So there's fragmentation, no doubt about that, and it's something that should concern us. And I think, honestly, what we really need to do is to try to work harder to generate news-literate consumers. That I think, whether it starts in high school or colleges or wherever, we need to have people understand that it's their job to get informed. And part of that is to reach out to multiple news sources and to not rely on any one news source. So some people will say, oh, I'm fully up to date on all the news. I watch Channel 6 every night. Okay, well, Channel 6 is a fine news organization, but
Sure.
It might be worth your trouble in terms of knowing what's going on in the Indianapolis area to also read the Indianapolis Star. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a contributor there, but you need more than one source.
Sure.
So you might check out WIBC Radio or Network Indiana. So I mean, you need a lot of different sources, and that's true certainly on the national level, because there's no question that CNN is covering different things than MSNBC is, and different than what Fox News Channel is. So if you're a cable news hound and you watch only one of those channels, you're probably not getting a broad enough agenda.
Okay. Got another question here from T. Kraft. Didn't want to share his first name with us. That's fine. Class of 1987. Seems like the media takes advantage of the fact most citizens are uneducated. With so many options for news and information, how does the average American vet if the information that they are getting on cable is accurate and unbiased? It all is biased, greatly so. Just as this administration has created so much distrust in how significant events and details information are released, how can the media ever be able to earn the trust of the viewers? When 50% of MSNBC viewers don't believe what Fox News is reporting and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot in the one question there, and I mean, this goes back to part of my answer to Dave and Martha Tucker, in that you need news from a variety of sources if you want to be fully informed.
Right.
But you mentioned something about the administration there, and I think it's worth us noting, and I wrote a column about this recently, that the Obama administration has probably not been as transparent with the press as a lot of people would have believed when the president took office 6 years ago. And I'm not saying that in any sort of partisan way, and one evidence of that is the fact that late last summer, the Society of Professional Journalists, which is a highly regarded news professional society, which of course was founded here at DePaul University, headed up a letter that was signed by 37 other media organizations complaining to the White House that the White House was not forthcoming with information that reporters needed to do their jobs. And this is not a partisan issue. But by the way, the Bush administration was criticized for some of the same things, okay? Sure. But I think there was a perception that things would change with a new administration, and I think probably they have not. But the news organizations, the 38 co-signers, were complaining that the administration was capriciously delaying freedom of information requests for government documents, that they were blackballing reporters and not giving access to reporters from who covered certain beats that they didn't like. That perhaps, well, of course, the snooping on reporters, getting their phone records and getting into their emails, that happened with the Associated Press and a Fox News reporter a year ago.
Right.
So I think there was a sense here that, and also this is an interesting one too, that the administration put into place for many of its spokesmen that they could not talk to the media without somebody else from the administration there to monitor the conversation. And of course that's designed to make people careful about what they might say to the press.
Right.
Now, Sure, if you work for an administration, you got to be careful what you're going to say to the press, but at a certain point, people who work for the government are our servants. And if they've got information and reporters have honest and fair questions, at some point they need honest and fair answers. And I think when news sources within the administration are always fearful that their conversations with the press are being monitored, that's very tough.
Yeah.
And this is interesting, you know, when the Associated Press scandal came up, you know, what, a year and a half ago by now, where the government was obtaining phone records and emails of Associated Press reporters. The president of the Associated Press gave a presentation just like 2 months, 10 weeks later, where he said, indeed, many of the news sources that the AP had used in the government had dried up just in that amount of time.
Wow.
Now that cuts down the flow of information. We need a flow of information, you know, to serve the needs of the democracy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've been talking a lot about the quality of reporting on the national level and the erosion of trust there from the public. It seems to me that reporting on the local level may be even more challenged. I think about the business models of local media. We have very little investigative reporting covering the Greencastle School Board, where you
Sure.
used to serve, I think, as a board member, or keeping our local government folks towing the line. Can you talk about the implications for local government and the state of trust in some of the smaller organizations?
That's a great question, and there's no doubt that the hard economy caused many news organizations, radio, TV, local newspapers, to cut back staff.
Right.
When they cut back, they're cutting back reporters, and usually the ones who have more time to put into investigative or long-form reporting.
Right.
So that is a particular problem. It's an economic decision, and I mean, there's a certain point where they've got to make the books balance.
Right, right.
But as a democracy and as citizens in any community, we lose the benefit then of having in-depth or long-form reporting. And I think those are just as important as investigative reporting.
Right.
But we lose the benefit of that. And there was a study that came out over the summer, I think by the Pew Research Center, which indicated that now state capitals don't have reporters staffing them around the clock, and a lot of news organizations don't have reporters full-time at the state capitol. In Indianapolis, of course, the Indianapolis Star staffs the state capitol full-time. Jim
Right.
Shell at Channel 8 is there a lot.
Sure.
But it used to be that TV stations from South Bend would send a reporter down to the state capitol while the legislature was in session. They can't afford to do that anymore.
Do that, right.
Fort Wayne, maybe rarely. Evansville, probably hardly ever. Terre Haute, only if there's a story of particular interest to them. So there has been a lot of cutback in local budgets directed at covering state and municipal governments, and we just will have less information about that. Or the information we get about those issues will come from rumor mills or Facebook posts.
Okay. Wow. We have another question online here. Ellen Kobe, hope I pronounced that correctly.
You did.
As the journalism industry constantly changes, there's obviously a lot to be critical of. What positive things do you see in the national news media right now? What are news outlets doing right?
I'm glad she brought that question up. Before I came here for this webinar this evening, I was at a dinner this evening hosted by Dr. Casey for the Rector Scholars. And as many of you know, Jack Morrill, the Professor Emeritus of Economics and Mathematics, was there, and because he coordinates the Rector Scholar program now, and he was aware of the webinar, and he said, well, he asked if I was going to come here and rip on the media, and I just said, well, the media need to be analyzed and critiqued because we want them to improve their performance. But honestly, I enjoy the media. I worked in the media for a long time. I have a lot of respect for what they do. It's a very tough job. It's a really tough job. Most reporters don't make a lot of money. They have very tough hours, very tough working conditions. Working on deadline is a very hard thing to do. But the thing I said to Dr. Morrill was, I kind of feel in this regard like the noted DePaul professor of lore, Professor Pence, used to say, this is too good to not be better.
Right.
And that's how I kind of feel about the performance of the news media in this day and age, that it's too good to not be better, and there's too much writing on it being better. I would say that there are some things that the news media does do well. I think local television has managed to maintain trust and credibility ratings in ways national media have not. Most studies show that for citizens, if they were to rank which news organizations they trust the most, television news on the local level is still high up there. Now, it could be because they like the weather person or they like watching sports.
Team, right.
Yeah,
but they view it as less partisan? Why is that?
I think it's because they feel closer to them. It's like their news organization, where I think, though, when you sit in Indiana and you watch CNN, you don't feel like it's yours.
Okay.
So that could be one of the reasons. I think that journalism is very good at covering emergencies. So when there's breaking news, something happens, they're very good to get on it quickly, to throw the resources at it. 911, for example, major Supreme Court decisions. Just in the last 24 hours, when the United States started its bombing campaign on Syria, a lot of good information, a lot of serious reporting being done about that. I think it's when we're in the time in between major news events that it's harder for us to decide what to do and what to throw the resources at, and there's a temptation to soften that agenda. So Ellen's point is well taken. I want to point out that they do a lot of good too.
Okay, great. Well, you mentioned Raymond Pence's quote, "Too good not to be better." Could you pick that up and illustrate what journalism and the media could look like in this country in an ideal sense? I mean, you referenced earlier the very real business model challenges that local media have that aren't going away. We have a public that lacks news literacy, which brings inherent challenges for news. What could it be like in a realistic sense in the 21st century?
Well, if it were idealistic, we would say people are well informed, we're covering news of substance constantly, and everybody's happy and singing together. That may not happen right away because of some of the barriers to getting that done. But I think one thing I'd like to see the news industry do, and by the way, I'm sitting here in academia,
so
I'm not having to balance the books, and I'm not in corporate board meetings or anything like that.
Right.
But one thing I wish that the corporate ownership of news organizations would do would be to reduce their expectations for profit margin. Okay? ABC is owned by Disney. All right, Disney is making huge money.
Right.
But they still put huge demands on ABC's news division to turn a profit. I don't think it would hurt to have a William Paley approach to that. Okay? And I would say into the newspaper industry, even if you have to cut resources, make sure that the journalism you do is serious and that it's covering the things of most substance for us. And then the other thing I would change, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is I think we need more efforts to make our citizenry more literate about the events of the day. And this might be a good place to put in a little plug for the Indiana University Center for Civic Literacy, because I attended their conference in August. They're doing really great work, and the whole point of this center, and it's run by Executive Director Sheila Kennedy, who's doing a great job. The whole point of this center is to try to find ways to make your citizenry more literate on any number of issues that affect them and making them more engaged in their own, community issues, to be aware of national issues and that sort of thing. So that would be one thing I think that as a society we should do. But it's going to have to come from school boards or universities or whatever. This is not surprising maybe in this era when college curriculums are looking to expand and grow and try new things. But I think I have this statistic right that only 1 in 5 United States colleges require a course in United States history.
Okay.
And now, there are a lot of ways to learn about historical understanding, but we're trying to create citizens and a generation of people who will understand what's going on out there. And if it were up to me as a professor of media studies, I would think it'd be a great curricular requirement that everybody take some course in the mass media. What's going to have more influence over the next 50 years of any college graduate's life than what they are going to be absorbing and learning about from the media that they consume? And a lot of media consumption is done kind of flying by the seat of our pants without a lot of critical assessment or analysis of what really happens when we consume certain messages. And like, for example, it's a little bit off the news target, but I'm going to bring it back to that. people who watch a lot of programming, television, film, or video games with violent content, their worldview changes. They start to view the world differently than if they hadn't absorbed that amount of violent content. And it is the same in news. There is research that shows that people who consume a lot of television news, and it's television news, okay, and not like newspaper news, people who consume a lot of television news start to perceive that the world is a more dangerous place than it really is. And researchers refer to that as the mean world syndrome. Well, I think everybody needs to know that. That if you consume a lot of media of a particular type, whether it's news or violent video games or whatever, at a certain point that starts to become part of your, your personality.
Right.
But I bet a lot of people don't know that because they haven't had a media literacy course.
Sure. Well, speaking of that media literacy course, curriculum requirements you suggested, Charlie Meyer just wrote in, class of 1986 from St. Louis. He's actually a parent of a first-year student, so he has a renewed interest in this question, but he wants to know what DePauw is doing to prepare students to be better at discerning news and news sources. So what's DePauw doing right now?
Well, it's great to hear from Charlie. Let's hope the Cardinals can hang in there for a few more days and get to the playoffs.
Do we have to go there? Cub fan?
I know, that's tough. Sorry, Steve. Well, DePauw has any number of media studies courses, and I would like to think that the students who get in them get a different perception on the function of the media and their use of the media than students who don't. We do not have any requirements at DePauw for students to have to take a media studies course.
Right.
Although some of the courses we have in media do count to meet the distribution requirements of the university. So an arts and humanities class, would maybe you would take something in communication study. Or like, for example, our media, culture, and society class meets the social science requirement at the university. Now, those courses are fully enrolled. So I think the students know that those are good courses to take and that there's a value in them. And we always have waiting lists for those courses. So I would say to Charlie, we're trying, but the students are not required. But I think there are a lot of good media studies courses. And if I might add one more thing, the student media is a great way, I think, for people to learn the power of the media, how the media operate. So a student who works in any of the student media here, for example, will understand the power of the media in a way by working on the inside that they wouldn't if they were on the outside. And for example, WGRE normally has about 200 students on staff every semester. Now, some of them come in to just check out the new music and to be DJs, but even while they're DJing, at the top of the hour is AP Network News that we pay a lot for. But whether they're interested in the news or not, they can't help but be in the control booth when that news is going on. So I'd like to think that those students who come through the doors of WGRE, even to DJ and play music, probably know more about what's going on in the news of any given day than those who don't.
Absolutely, they do. Charlie actually has a follow-up question here. Please share your thoughts about the news coverage of the riots in Ferguson, Missouri. He says, it appeared that after the initial few days of the riots, the media personnel outnumbered the protesters.
I don't think there's any question now that the media helped create news during those difficult times rather than just report it. I observed a lot of the news coverage, as I could from here. Now, I don't know about the local news coverage in St. Louis, but just how the national media played it out. And I watched a lot of different network news, the cable channels, to kind of get a sense of how they're covering it and what their role was. Some of the reporting tried to get involved with the protesters. So I think that's always a problem when reporters become part of the story. I also think it's dangerous that some of the reporters started interviewing what they call man-on-the-street interviews, and they started getting, on the record, so to speak, input from people who were maybe not in the best position to comment. Now, I mean, everybody's entitled to their opinions, but not all opinions are created equal, all right? So sometimes they ended up talking to people who said they were witnesses at a demonstration or at an altercation or maybe on the day of the shooting, and then later we find out, well, we don't know what their role is or if they were even really there, okay? And I like talking about this subject because there are a lot of different factors that we can think about in terms of the role of the media and the interaction and covering not only spot news, which that was, but also the intersection of news and culture, because we're covering really a culture clash here, there. But anyway, to kind of get a sense beyond just my own observations, I had a visit with a professional videographer who's now retired from Channel 8, and an African American, okay? And I talked to him. You know, what did he think about the coverage? How would he have done it? You know, where was the media fair? Where was it unfair? He seemed to think, consistent with what I'd been perceiving, that the media had helped maybe actually even maybe trigger some of their response, or maybe that they hadn't gone in as reporters as much as to somehow be participants at times, okay? And then I also had a chat with an Indiana State policeman who could kind of give me the sense from the standpoint, now he wasn't there, of course, but from the standpoint of a law enforcement official as to how to manage those kinds of demonstrations, how a crime scene would be investigated, what might have happened at that crime scene, and he was also concerned for the media's role in that. And I think it's probably fair to say that what happened in Ferguson over several days might not have been exactly the same if the media had been absent. Now, of course, that's crazy, because the media's got to go cover the initial shooting and the follow-up, you know, unrest. But how the media covered it might have played a factor in that. And for people who really are interested in this, there's a professor at Southern Illinois University named William Freivogel. And he writes an online publication called Gateway Journalism Review, which focuses on news and media issues in the St. Louis area. I'm pretty sure you can access it online, but William Freivogel did a very insightful and helpful analysis of the Ferguson media coverage a couple weeks ago. And for people who really want to follow up more on that, I would encourage them to go read Professor Freivogel's analysis.
Okay. I think we have a question here in Watson Forum now. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself before you share your questions so our viewers know who you are.
I'm Al Pankratz, retired faculty member. Jeff, do you have some comments about the place and role of C-SPAN, public television and radio, and other similar sources in this whole quality of news reporting controversy?
Sure.
You heard that okay?
Yes. Okay, the question was, you know, what is the role of C-SPAN and public television, NPR, those kinds of sources in our journalistic landscape today? I used to work for an NPR affiliate in my early reporting days. I was news director at an NPR affiliate in Missouri for several years, so maybe I'm a little biased because I used to work there, and I used to occasionally string reports for the NPR network for Morning Edition or All Things Considered. So I have fond memories of having worked with them, and I think they do great work. And you know, I'm proud of the work they're doing, and you know, same with public television and C-SPAN. The challenge with those organizations at the moment is that their ratings are generally so low that they're not a big player in the national news agenda. And I say that with disappointment, because the kind of reporting they're doing is more long form, it's more serious in nature, it's less shrill, generally speaking, particularly C-SPAN. You know, the discussions they have are all very civil, but they're not having to hit the next commercial break. They're not, you know, trying to get a rating spike at any given time by covering a sensational trial. So I wish that they had larger roles to play. And I'm not criticizing them because they don't, because it's not their fault. They don't have massive marketing budgets. They don't have massive resources. And I wish they had a bigger role, but the sad fact is, in terms of the national news landscape, they're bit players at this time. Now, interestingly, there are some proposals out there from theorists and professors like Robert McChesney to try to make more publicly funded journalism part of the media landscape, where the federal government would take on a greater role in funding news organizations and creating more
publicly funded journalism. I respect that point of view, but I disagree with it, frankly, because I'm not sure government funding of any news organization is a great thing, because there's always a temptation to think that the government has somehow played the news, or that the funding would come back and forth depending on how it worked. And I mean, we see that already in Congress. I mean, the NPR, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting budget is minuscule. Well, you know this, Professor Pankratz. In terms of the entire federal government, the funding spent on public broadcasting is virtually negligible. But it's always a political hot potato in the House of Representatives, because people want to cut the budget because NPR, ran this kind of story, or their commentators are too liberal or something like that. So I wouldn't go down the path of saying we need more government funding of news, but I think the model that McChesney talks about, where we make it less commercial oriented, could work if you got foundations to support journalism and provided the financial support, but then got out of it, okay? I mean, if you went to a huge philanthropic foundation and they invested, it would take billions, obviously, in news organizations, that would be fine, but there'd have to be no strings attached, or else that news would be considered tainted one way or the other. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on this last point. Do you have any thoughts about how would you compare quality of coverage, the BBC as compared to what happens in the U.S.?
So if you could repeat the question.
The question from Professor Pankratz was how would I compare the coverage of, say, the BBC compared to news coverage in the United States. That is a great question, but I think I'm probably not going to answer that. There's an old expression that you don't want to outkick your coverage in football. And I just don't follow the BBC closely enough. I certainly respect what they do. I sometimes listen to them on XM radio, but I don't follow them enough to probably have a good sense. I will say this, though. The BBC has a reputation for covering international news much more effectively than American media. And the American media does have kind of a narrow vision at times to think we're only going to cover something if it's right down our street, and we're not interested in third world countries or Eastern Europe or Asia or anything unless there's a direct impact on the United States. And I think I can safely say that the BBC does have a broader vision, which I think would benefit our news media in the United States. And it takes me back a little bit to one of the early questions we had about, the days of Huntley Brinkley and Howard K. Smith and Walter Cronkite. Yeah. They believed in the importance of international news. And in the 50s and 60s, all the major networks had bureaus all around the world, including Moscow and, London and Africa and South America. And in the cutbacks, because the networks have had to be profit centers, those go first. I'm sure that CBS has no correspondent full-time in South America. Now, they might have a couple people down there that they could call if something drastic happened, and they could call a stringer, a part-time correspondent, somebody maybe who works for a news organization in Brazil, who CBS could call and say, hey, get there as fast as you can and give us a report. But my guess is they do not have any bureau in many parts of the world anymore.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Here's one more from Tad Kraft, who writes, I think Dr. McCall raises a significant point that any media show funded by advertisers follows public opinion. Mm-hmm. Look at the NFL and recent issues. Media coverage formed public opinion and had great impact on a business. Look at news at the top of the hour, sandwiched by advertisers. If it's not entertaining, who will watch? And what business will pay for the airtime?
News organizations have to have eyeballs.
Right.
TV especially, they've got to have people watching or they're not going to be able to pay the bills.
Right.
And studies done by the Radio Television News Directors Association confirm that most news directors at local stations will report that in any given year they are pressured sometime or another by their general manager or their sales department to either cover something or not cover something in respect for the advertiser. So that's a very real pressure. It's a dangerous pressure, and one that obviously professional journalists would try to resist.
I would bring it back to DePauw, a little bit closer to home. You know, we have such a proud tradition here on this campus, from Kilgore to Hogate to McQuethy, Brett Baer, Aaron Lucetti. What is it about this place, switching gears a little bit, that produces journalists of that quality over generations now? Is there a secret sauce at DePauw that enables that kind of tradition to continue?
Well, it'd be nice to know what that is, but I think DePauw should really be proud of its media heritage, and as you said, it goes way, way back. You know, I can't quantify this, but I would dare say that for a school our size, to have turned out so many prominent journalists over the years is remarkable and maybe unprecedented, you know, in the United States. But I think there are a couple things at play. I mean, I'm a believer in the liberal arts.
Right.
That the main thing a reporter needs is understanding of a wide range of issues. And as a graduate of a liberal arts university like DePauw, not that we're the only ones who do that, but I think we do it fine, that if somebody wants to go become a reporter, they presumably have had some political science, a course in philosophy, maybe a course in logic, maybe they were on the debate team while they were here. Certainly history, I talked about the importance of that earlier, sociology. And I think that's easy to have happen at DePauw given the curricular requirements we have, the ease of which students can go back and forth across departments, and the ease at which students who aren't even studying media or communication can come in and get themselves involved in student media and maybe find an interest there that they didn't think they had coming to college. So I think it's a combination of those things, but you know, frankly, I think one of the things is you look back to 1909, the Sigma Delta Chi, the Society of Professional Journalists, was founded here. So many of those individuals went off to great media careers of their own, and I think they became trendsetters and leaders, and I think subsequent generations of people who came to DePauw would look back and say, look what they did, this is something we want to follow. I mean, when I was a student here in the 70s, we knew the great names, the Pulliams, for example, as, you know, legendary, you know, journalists, and the Hogates. And so I think there's always been a proud sense of that, and so I would hope that even today's, you know, media studies students would value the tradition that's been created and hope to go out and make their own play in that.
Certainly if there's a McQuethy or a Brett Baer at WGRE or the DePauw newspaper, you've had a role in bringing those young people along. So I thank you for that, and thank you for sharing your time and expertise with our alumni tonight. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And I want to remind our viewers that our next session in the Virtual Alumni College will be October 16th, when Doug Smith, graduate of the class of 1968, will speak on happiness, the art of living with peace, confidence, and joy. So you can register for that through the alumni homepage, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much. Good night.